So we've just received our delivery of blocks here that we get every week. We've got a bunch of different varieties here. I'm going to just open them up and put them here in the room. Let's start with Reishi. Reishi is an interesting one because we don't actually open the bag at all. For the first stage, we let it fruit inside the bag. It's because it really likes the high humidity and the high CO2 environment in here will help it to form the little conchs inside the bag. And to begin with, you'll get antlers forming in here in that environment. They just start to grow up. So we actually leave them in here for at least 2 weeks or so, sometimes longer, until we start to see those antlers get to around about that sort of size before we open the bag, which exposes them to lower levels of CO2 that'll force them to then go into producing their conch. So you can see here the different phases of the reishi. We've put our new bag in, but you can see these bags here actually, which are just 1 week older. You can see the very first signs of the antlers forming, this bright yellow colour. It's a beautiful colour, the way that reishi forms. It forms these little kind of nodules to begin with that raise up off the surface of the substrate. You can see them forming all around the block here, these little yellow and white colorations. The leading edge of the growth is always white, and then it goes behind it a whole beautiful range of colours. You get this bright yellow, and then the bright yellow turns into a kind of orangey, and then followed by a red colour. This shows it quite well actually in here. Look at the colours of that. We do something pretty similar with Maitake. Maitake also likes to develop inside the bag to begin with in that high CO2, high humidity environment. You can see just the very, very first stages of pinning starting to occur here. Maitake is quite a tricky mushroom to grow actually. It's definitely not a beginner's mushroom. There's multiple stages to the early part of the fruiting process. It forms these little nodules, and then it forms little sort of branches that come off of those, and then it forms the petals later on. So we like to leave it in the bag until it's quite far on in that process before we'll then cut the corner, which will start to introduce a bit of fresh air into the bag and reduce the carbon dioxide levels, but still keep the humidity high for a lot of its development before we'll then cut the bag towards the end of the process to let the petals, really open up into full fronds. So again, with this one, I'm just going to put it on the shelf for now and we'll keep an eye on it. So we've also got some shiitake down here. Now shiitake, we'll have to take that outside because we tend to strip the bag off completely. It's got its own protective layer, this brown sort of crusty layer on the outside of the substrate, which protects it from slightly lower humidity than what it gets in the bag. But it likes to grow off of the whole block, all the way around the block. So we're going to strip the bag off completely, and then we usually hose it down outside just to wash it off. That usually becomes a pinning trigger as well. So these will go outside, and we'll do that with it in a minute before it will come into the fruiting room. We also have some turkey tail up here. Now turkey tail is one that we do open up as it arrives. So we squash all the air out of the bag. That just stops any pinning from happening inside the bag. And then we'll place it on the shelves. And we just put 2 slits horizontally across the bag. And where those slits are, it starts to pick up the fresh air environment inside the room alongside the humidity and the light, which then becomes a trigger for it to start pinning. It takes a long time to grow turkey tail, around about 60 days from when we first bring it in to point of harvest, and you can see what it looks like at various phases here. These were put in the room 3 weeks ago now at this point, so it gives you some idea of how slow they are at growing. They first of all start to form where you've cut the slits along the whole line, and you can see another one here that's a bit further on. So they just slowly start to open out as they grow. To begin with, they're this sort of yellowy white colour, cream sort of colour, and then there's one here that's a bit more mature. This one is around about 40 days in, and you can see if you look at it from the top that the colour is just starting to develop on the top of the caps, and that kind of whitey creamy colour will become the underside of the caps. So this will probably take about another 2 to 3 weeks for the caps to fully open out and develop before we come to the point of harvest. Very slow growing mushroom, prefers slightly lower humidity than many other varieties as well. We also have a bunch of lion's mane in here, which you can see fruiting behind me here as well. Lion's mane is a lovely mushroom to grow. It's obviously really popular these days as well. It's actually pretty easy to grow. Certainly once it's got to this point of full colonisation, lion's mane really just bursts out of the bag if you give it half a chance. So a bit like the turkey tail, we're going to just fold the bag over and cut a slit in it. There's different ways you can do the slits. Everyone's got their own preference. You can either go with a couple of slits like that and you'll get 2 distinct clusters, or you can just go right the way across the front of the bag and it will just start to climb out all the way along there. You can see all the different phases of lion's mane fruit in here actually. So this is one that's pretty early in. Just the very first stages of the pins starting to form there. And from there they sort of develop a little bit further. A bit like you can see over here on these examples. They almost look a bit like a brain, certainly at this point when they've gone a bit further. I mean, take a look at that. That's just absolutely gorgeous. All these wrinkling patterns on the top of the mushroom. Tends to take on a bit of a pinkish colour at the beginning. Once it gets to this stage, very quickly after that, you'll see it just completely open up, start to grow further out, and then the characteristic spines of lion's mane start to develop. At first they're quite tight like this, and then they open out into something like this, where the spines elongate. And this crop here is pretty mature. We'll come back and harvest this in just a minute.
So these lion's manes have just been harvested yesterday. I just love this mushroom. It's an absolutely beautiful thing to look at, of course, but the properties as well are just stunning. We did a separate video on that. But yeah, it's reported to have, brain boosting functions. It can help treat anxiety, depression. It's just absolutely wonderful with all the compounds that it can release into your gut, but also your brain. And what I'm doing now is just chopping these up, and then they'll go onto that tray over there, put them in the dehydrator overnight, and that's how we cycle them so we can use them in our tinctures. So obviously just now I mentioned them for use in tinctures, but you don't need to at all. You can just use them in your food as well. They're absolutely wonderful to eat. And I think part of the reason for that is not just that they look different, they've got a beautiful flavor, but also the texture. It just really holds well when you cook them. So that means you don't, some people I speak to, they complain a bit about, growing up on, being fed soggy mushrooms, for instance, and you just don't get that with these things. So if you just slightly fry them, maybe a little bit of butter, maybe a little bit of oil, and a bit of garlic, then it's absolutely stunning. So this is just one of the tasks on the farm here. In a bit I can show you, we've got this task sheet that we sort of stick with. I say sort of, I mean that we stick with, of course. There's a few of us here on the farm who work on different days, so we just try and make sure that everything gets done in a clear, consistent way, which is actually quite important when you grow mushrooms, because the mushrooms will do a lot of the work, of course, i.e. the growing, but they will work on their own timescales, and you don't really want to miss the perfect point to harvest, or other tasks need to fit in around that, like cleaning the filters, cleaning the fruiting room, all those sorts of things, composting bags that you no longer want to use. All of that sort of stuff needs to be done, and it needs to be done in a sensible way, of course, and at the right time. So at a previous farm, the mushrooms that we grew, we sold as food, basically. So for cafes, restaurants, and just private consumers to use. At the moment, there's a whole new direction that we're heading into, and that's the medicinal mushrooms. Mushrooms as a food supplement to boost your health, boost your immunity, boost your mental health. So yeah, that's really exciting. It's a whole new direction for us here. This, with lion's mane, when you cut it, I think it sometimes resembles like cutting through a cauliflower. It looks a bit like a cauliflower as well, I find, in the whiteness, and that's just, it's such a beautiful organism. So I mentioned this goes in the dryer overnight. We keep it at about 50 centigrades, and then it goes for about 15 hours. And then we see in the morning if it's dry enough. It normally is. And sometimes, just to be sure, we just run it for another sort of couple of hours, and then we cycle a new batch in. So the other thing about lion's mane, of course, is that their appearance is just so different, right? These are called teeth. And yeah, it just looks like coral or something. It's an amazing, amazing thing. And it's unlike other mushrooms, of course, you can clearly see that. And here, this sponginess, all the goodness that it holds, it's yeah, it's a thing of wonder. Now, obviously, the setup I'm working with here, that resembles a bit of an industrial setup, and you don't need to have this sort of setup if you want to dry your mushrooms at all. In fact, at home, you can just do it in your oven, for instance. I'd probably recommend going for a pretty low setting, something like 40, 50 degrees. That's Celsius. Leave the door open so the moisture can escape, and you can put it in there for about 4 or 5 hours. It will be, because those ovens aren't always particularly accurate, so the way you can check is just by grabbing a piece, and then when you bend it, it should snap, basically. That's the point where you know it's dry enough that it's totally dehydrated. So of course, not many people have seen a mushroom like the lion's mane before. These are just cultivated here in our fruiting room, of course, so we're getting pretty used to the sight of them. Never really see them in the wild here in the UK, really. Very rare as a sighting. They're actually heavily protected. I think it's one of about 4 mushrooms which you can actually land yourself a jail time for if you're caught harvesting that or foraging for it. I have actually seen one in the wild here in a bit of woodlands close by here, and yeah, both Adam and I, we just had to stop ourselves and just go like, wow, this is an absolutely incredible moment. So it makes sense, of course, when you run a unit like this, just to make sure it runs when it's fully loaded. I'm a little bit short, but luckily I saw there's a couple, 2 or 3 lion's manes ready for harvest today, so I'm going to grab those now, add them to the trays, put them in, and then overnight this will dry for us.